He seemed to buy what I was saying, so I relaxed a little bit. Thanks. So what can I do for you, Vincent? Just wanted to introduce myself properly. He said, was everything okay since that night with the mice? Yeah, you were probably right. It was just mice. I brushed it off and told him to sit down. Would you like some coffee or something to drink? No, it's okay. I have to get back soon anyway. My wife Marjorie is probably impatient already. He sat down. His phone buzzed, so he pulled it out and started typing a message. So, what do you do for a living, Nate? He asked while vigorously typing on his phone, the sound of tapping resounding in the room. I work as a freelancer, coding stuff, that kind of thing. I replied, sitting on a chair across from him. That's so? You work from home? He nodded, taking his gaze away from the phone for a second to look at me before continuing to type. Yeah. How about you? How long have you been in this apartment? Oh, since the building was built. It was me, my wife and our 19-year-old daughter Susan, but she moved out about 6 months ago. He continued typing. That sounds great. Speaking of that, I wanted to ask you something. I paused for a moment while the sound of typing continued. Do you know anything about the previous tenant of this apartment? I asked. Vincent stopped typing suddenly, but continued staring at his phone. The previous tenant? He asked and frowned for a moment, before shaking his head. No, don't know the person. Why do you ask? He scratched his cheek, finally locking eyes with me. I was just curious, is all. I see. Well, I'd better get going. He slapped his knees and stood up. If you ever want to drop by for a cup of coffee or lunch, Marjorie makes a hell of a casserole. Thanks. I weakly smiled. He turned around at the threshold, saying, Oh, and one more thing. You be careful while hiking, yeah? Don't go too far ahead, even with that flashlight. That Route 5 can be a little tricky sometimes. You understand? He was very serious. Yeah. I got it. I nodded. I noticed that he was looking over my shoulder at the storage door. Good. He smiled and looked back at me after a moment of awkward pause. Have a good one, Nate. He waved and left, just like last time. I closed the door, replaying the conversation in my head. Was Vincent hiding something? My thoughts were interrupted when I saw the flashlight and rope on the table and remembered my mission for tonight. I took a nap in order to stave off being sleepy and woke up around 8 p.m. I ordered some food and, like the previous night, turned on the TV to pass the time. When it was 2 a.m., I took the flashlight and tested if it worked. I turned off the lights in my apartment and made sure it could illuminate a good distance. I also took some spare batteries despite the ones in the torch being fully charged. You never know. I took the rope and tied it to the leg of the couch, and I tied the other end to my left wrist. I then proceeded to sit down on my couch and continued watching TV. 3:19 a.m. came, and sure enough, the loud click of the door resounded in the room, followed by the loud creaking as the door opened wide, revealing the abyssal entrance in front. I stood up. It was time. I grabbed the torch and turned it on, pointing it at the dark corridor. It illuminated a good distance, but at the end of the beam was just more darkness. Part of me had hoped that the corridor wasn't that long, but that hope had vanished now, and part of me realized that what I was dealing with could not be explained logically. Without further thinking, I stepped across the threshold and was immediately overcome by cold. I had completely forgotten about that. I was determined not to let that stop me, and I didn't want to go back to dig out a jacket, so I simply proceeded. The corridor was barely wide enough for one person to pass through. The ceiling was just inches above my head. The entire corridor seemed to be made out of plain concrete, walls, floor, and ceiling. Step by step, I went deeper into the gaping mouth of the darkness, leaving the solace of my apartment behind me and dragging the rope tied to my wrist. I glanced back at the open door every now and then, afraid it would close earlier than I expected. As I went further in, the light which emanated from my apartment through the crack gradually became smaller and smaller until I could barely see it. I heard distant creaking from time to time, which enforced my theory that there were other doors on the other side and not just the one for my storage. My brain was telling me to stop and go back, but I was just too curious. I had to know what was on the other end. I went on, glancing at the watch from time to time. I figured I should go forward no more than 25 minutes, so that I have time to get back before the door closes. The door from my apartment was now just a small dot, and the creaking in the distance became more frequent. At moments it felt like it was coming from behind me, so I turned around, but would see nothing. I glanced at my watch. It was 3:45 a.m. Just 5 more minutes and then I'll turn back, I thought. I'll run back to make it in time. I went on a little bit further and then saw something different from the repetitive pathway up until now. There was something white on the ground. I approached it and realized it was a piece of paper. I bent down and pointed my torch at it. There were 2 words scrawled on it. 2 simple words. Go back. I read the words aloud and stared at them in bewilderment. Who left this here? Either way, it was time for me to go back, since it was almost 4 a.m. and the rope was probably almost at its end. I stood up and just then, I felt something which made my blood run cold. The rope which held my hand was gently tugged. I hoped that it was my imagination, so I stood still and pointed the flashlight down. My hand was trembling, but not moving. And then I felt the rope tightening and saw my hand moving back and forth once. And then once more. And then again. I held my breath, listening to the creaking sound in the distance behind me which echoed. Suddenly, my hand was tugged violently enough to almost make me lose my footing, and I quickly wiggled out of the rope and watched as it fell limply and slid across the ground, disappearing in the dark beyond the flashlight beam. I trembled violently, and not from the cold. The beam of my flashlight aggressively bounced up and down from my trembling hands as the sound of door creaking got louder and louder until it felt like whatever was making that sound would just jump into my line of sight any second. I stared like that, breathing heavily, and then the creaking suddenly came to a halt. It was replaced by another sound, but I couldn't tell what it was. It sounded like something being dragged on the floor. And then I saw it. A hand appeared in the light, a pale, skinny hand, with dirty and ruined fingernails that looked like they had been clawing at something solid. Another hand appeared, trying to get a firm grip on the ground with bony fingers. Very slowly, the hands dragged into view a head with messy, black hair which fell unevenly on the floor, covering the face which was looking down. I couldn't do anything but stare, as the head lifted up, revealing one bloodshot eye which was not obscured by the messy hair and a face as pale as the floor below it. The woman then opened her mouth and from it came a loud door creaking noise. That was enough to break me out of my trance. I turned around and ran as fast as I could in the other direction, not caring where I would end up. The creaking noise followed closely behind, never growing louder or more quieter, but being present just enough to muffle my own panicked breathing as I ran. I sprinted through the corridor like that until my lungs started burning, and then in front of me I saw a small white dot. As I ran, the dot got bigger and bigger, revealing a door-shaped hole, and I knew that I had to reach it, for it was my only means of escaping. The creaking persisted, right at my heels, and I knew that if I slowed down or stopped to take a break, that woman would catch up with me. The exit was so close now. I pushed my unwilling legs to continue going, holding my flashlight unsteadily in my hand. The white light which emanated from the door offered salvation. I knew about that, so I had to reach it before that thing caught up with me. Just as I was completely blinded by the bright light from the door, I crossed the threshold, practically stumbling over something and painfully falling to the ground. I turned around just in time to see the woman from before standing a few feet away from me. She produced a weak creaking sound before retreating back in the darkness. And then the door abruptly shut with a loud bang, leaving me in total silence. I took a moment to calm myself down and absorb what just happened. I stood up, and as I was about to turn around, a voice behind me spoke. "You fell for it, huh?" I turned around just in time to see a man standing in the room. I stared at the man under the dim light, who simply flashed me a smile. Although he couldn't have been older than 30, he had heavy bags under his eyes, his hair was messy, and his cheekbones visible. "Who are you?" I asked him and observed my surroundings, still breathing heavily from the ordeal just before. I seemed to be located in an apartment, but it looked like it had been abandoned for a while. The walls were dilapidated, cracked and stained with various colors. A musty couch sat in the corner of the room, and the coffee table next to it looked like it would collapse if you leaned on it with one finger. The kitchen was in no better shape either, with the oven and other surfaces being covered in rust. The rest of the apartment was empty, like someone had selectively taken things out. "Where are we?" I asked. "My name's Martin," the man responded, "and we are in room 102. The room isn't occupied yet since it still needs some cleaning done, but it should be ready soon." "Ready soon? Are you kidding?" I let out a chuckle at the absurdity of his response. "Seriously though, what's going on here?" Martin frowned and put his hands behind his back. "I'm not sure what you mean. Did you not just see that thing in there?" I pointed to the door, frustrated. Martin stared at me with a neutral facial expression. It was as if he didn't comprehend what I was saying. "Listen, I just came here to tell you that they're looking for you. So come on, you already kept them waiting a while." He shrugged calmly. Before I could process what he said, let alone respond to it, Martin opened the front door and waved for me to follow him. "Wait a second." I reached out with my arm in futility, but he was already gone. I glanced at the door which I dropped out of, which despite its decay looked very similar to my own storage door. I made sure it was still closed and then ran after Martin. "Martin!" I called out to him, stepping out into the corridor, but he was gone. I muttered a "what the fuck" to myself when I saw what was in front of me. It was clear that I was in my apartment building, but it was as if it had completely changed. The walls out here were no better than inside room 102, having lost their original color probably ages ago and their outer layers crumbling. There were various scratches and writings, which made me assume it was vandalism. Upon closer inspection, I realized that they were incoherent, but enigmatic messages which grabbed my attention. "Can't find him." One of the walls said in crude letters, indicating it must have been carved with little to no care or skill. As I turned around, I saw another message on the opposite wall. "Where is he?" Despite my surreal predicament, I couldn't help but stare at the writings, trying to figure out what they could all mean. Who wrote this and why? Can't find who? I proceeded down the hallway, seeing more and more messages on the walls, which became increasingly more desperate. Who is he? Tricked. Help me. Can't get out.
Please like, share and subscribe. Part 4 to come.